Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here. I want to start with just a little bit more about myself to elicit questions at the end of this brief talk. I am considered an African expert until I walk into a room with a bunch of Africans, right? So here I'm not an African expert. You're the African expert. You live there. So what I'll give you is a perspective from an outsider on Africa. I started studying Africa in the mid-1980s and haven't stopped since. So I'd like to share my ideas more than lecture to you about my ideas. My background, just a little bit more so you know who I am, maybe stimulate some questions after this talk. I first got involved in Africa in the mid-1980s when I lived in Zambia for 2 years as a high school teacher. I taught African history. Don't ask me how that happened. I read a lot of books really fast. And I came back from Zambia as a born-again capitalist. It was a very interesting experience. I did live in South Africa, 93 to 94. I got to watch Nelson Mandela get elected in Soweto, which is one of those defining moments of my life. I'm a professor and a consultant, so I teach, I write a lot of books, and I do a fair amount of consulting up here in America, so I do have a pretty good sense of the American perspective on Africa, and you're welcome to ask me about that as well. I edit the journal, as was just mentioned, called African Security. That's important to note because I've been the editor of this journal for 6 years. I read every single article that comes to my desk. Many are sent from Africa. Many are sent from here and from Europe. And it keeps me in touch with what other people think is important about African security. So later on, you can ask anything you would like about that. The things I've gotten most recently are a lot of articles on Boko Haram, almost one every month or so. A lot of articles on the African Union and the African peace and security architecture, whether it works or doesn't work and why not. And quite a few articles on human security versus national security. How do we redefine security, particularly in the African context, and I'll return to that. And as was mentioned, I just finished writing a book called The Nature of War in Africa. I was doing the final edits in my room this morning. That book talks about how war has evolved in Africa with case studies on Darfur, the DRC, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Ethiopia, Eritrea. Okay. So I was asked to come here to talk about two things. One I'm something of an expert in, the other not so much, on both African security and, of course, ethics. So I'm going to start with George C. Marshall, who some of you may have heard of. George C. Marshall is the patron saint of the Virginia Military Institute, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense during World War II. And we named a center after him at VMI called the George C. Marshall Center for Leadership and Ethics. I want to start by talking about Marshall's rules of good ethical behavior and leadership. I'm going to list them to you. I'll return to them at the end of this talk and link them to African security. My argument is at the end of this talk, very simple. Good leadership is ethical. In order to address the security challenges that we have in Africa, you will have to follow Marshall's rules. So when I give you these list of ethical guidelines that George C. Marshall laid out, they're not abstract guidelines that we put over here and think about, you know, at the end of the day when we're done work. These are ethical guidelines that should help us make the right decisions directly related to African security needs. I'll return to them. So here they are. There's 6 ethical rules according to George C. Marshall. Number 1, candor. Speak honestly and responsibly. Number 2, commitment. Adhere to what is right. Number 3, courage. Be bold in speech and deed. Number 4, integrity. Speak and act with honor. Number 5, selflessness. Service above self-interest. And number 6, sometimes my favorite because of my own reading, choose the right people to work for you. Choose the right people to work for you. They're his ethical guidelines. He also had 2 strategic guidelines. I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes talking about these strategic guidelines and then return to how the ethical guidelines actually complement or reinforce his strategic guidelines, and then, of course, open it for questions. Just 2 strategic points that he'd like to talk about. Number 1, mastering the situation. Mastering the situation. Understand the situation around you. As Secretary of Defense, and Chief of Staff of the Army during World War II, he had to master the situation. Number two, focusing on the big picture, or what we call the principle of vision, might be my favorite. We have a collection of leaders from Africa in this room, and I think you all know one thing. It's one of my mantras. Conflicts in Africa spread. No conflict in Africa is their own conflict. Your conflict is your next-door neighbor's conflict, is their next-door neighbor's conflict, is their next-door neighbor's conflict. If you focus just on your state and the national security of your state, the chances are you're ignoring the neighborhood, the region, and if you ignore the region, I think we all know bad things tend to happen. So I'm going to talk first of all about mastering the situation a little bit. From my perspective as an outsider who spent about a quarter century studying Africa, I'm going to talk about Africa's evolving security landscape, which is one of your talking points on your syllabus for this. When I say evolving security landscape, I'm trying to say this. Conflict in Africa is nothing new. Conflict in America is nothing new. Right? Conflict is the world's oldest profession. Right? There's been war since Cain and Abel. But conflict tends to take an evolutionary path. It evolves. Conflicts don't spring up from nothing. Right? Conflicts evolve from prior conflicts, which evolve from prior conflicts. The argument I try to make in my book is that, in fact, in order to understand Africa, or anywhere else I would argue, you have to understand pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial history. Right? There's an evolutionary logic here. Now, when I say there's an evolutionary logic, I'm not saying that history repeats itself. We have a famous American author, many of you will know, Mark Twain. He said, history does not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. It does not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. My favorite saying actually is from an American comedian named Lily Tomlin. She talks about why we need to understand history. She says, history repeats itself because nobody listened the first time. So maybe if we listen the first time, have a little bit of an understanding of where we're coming from, we'll have an understanding of where we're going. Now, the next point I was going to make here, but I'm going to skip ahead a little bit because I want to leave a lot of room for discussion, is there's been a lot of conflict in Africa since the end of the Cold War. I think you know that. We can debate how much there's been, but there's a lot of conflict in Africa, particularly after the Cold War. I'll skip to my last stat. I have a lot of statistics. The UN has conducted 19 complex peace operations since the end of the Cold War. 10 of them have been in Africa. So more than half the UN operations dealing with complex peace operations since the end of the Cold War have been in Africa. And I think we need to understand why that is. These conflicts since 2000, since the year 2000, have estimated cost of $700 billion in damages to Africa. Right? Since 2000, the damages due to conflict in Africa, $700 billion. And I don't know about you, but here in America, where we have big budget fights, we could use that $700 billion. Right? So how has war evolved in Africa? And I'm going to go through this fairly quickly and get to today's wars. How has it evolved? And I think you'll see a pattern here. Remember, history rhymes if it does not repeat itself. I think you will see a pattern. And what we're talking about today is breaking out of this pattern, right? We want to get out of this pattern of evolving conflict in Africa and everywhere else in the world. It's not unique to Africa by any sense of the imagination. We start with the early independence years, late 1950s through the 1960s. We call these the decades of coups d'etats. Since 1957, I believe that's the date of independence for Ghana, but you can correct me if I'm wrong, there were 70 successful coups d'etats in Africa. 70 successful coups d'etats in Africa. We're not talking about the unsuccessful coups d'etats, right, which would multiply that number by something, I'm not sure what. Why? Why so many coups d'etats in Africa in the immediate decades after independence? I would argue that the theme that rhymes with modern-day Africa, or the thread that takes us from the post-independence decades all the way through to today, is the zero-sum nature of some African politics. The zero-sum nature of some African politics. By that I mean that there's two sets of people, winners and losers. The winners get the State House, and the influence and the power and the economic opportunity that comes with having the State House, and the losers don't get so much. Okay? The losers don't get so much. After coup d'etats, you had a wave of reform insurgencies. We in America like reform insurgencies because we like the word reform. What do we mean by reform insurgencies? Well, Sam Huntington, the famous American political scientist, calls this the first wave of democratization, if you remember that. So we have a wave of democratization. It doesn't last very long in much of Africa. It doesn't last very long. It had an ambivalent legacy. Some countries, Botswana always comes to mind, managed to introduce democracy and sustain that democracy through many decades. Others had democracy on and off, fits and starts. As you know, Nigeria, I know we have a participant from Nigeria. We have military rule, civilian rule, military rule. So we have an ambivalent record of reform politics after those coup d'etats. Then during the Cold War, we have a round of civil wars. A round of civil wars. Civil war is a very technical term in political science, because we're going to talk about this later. Civil wars is when one group is trying to overthrow the state, or one group is trying to secede from the state. Okay? One group is trying to overthrow the state and get in power. One group is trying to secede from the state and start their own state. Many of these civil wars, as you know, were fueled by the Cold War, by the rivalry between the Soviet Union and the United States. I'm guessing that the civil war in Angola would not have been as long and not been as nasty if it wasn't for the Soviets, the Americans, and the Cubans. I'm guessing that the civil war in Mozambique would not have been as nasty, not as long, if it wasn't for the Cold War rivalry of the North. I'm guessing that apartheid might have come to an end a little bit faster in South Africa if it weren't for the rivalry between the West and the East. I'm guessing that Zimbabwe would have got independence before 1980 if it wasn't because of the Cold War rivalry. Somalia and Ethiopia got engaged in the Cold War rivalry. These Cold Wars come to pretty much to an end at the end of the Cold War, which is kind of interesting. What we have at the end of the Cold War is a new type of war, my argument. They're not necessarily civil wars. Some of them are, some of them aren't, but many of them evolve into something else. The famous political scientist Paul Collier says that there are 78 civil wars in Africa between 1960 and 1999. Between 1960 and 1999. I'm going to tell you right now, he's wrong. Although he did make Time magazine's top 100 important people, and I did not. But I still think he's wrong. I think many of these things that we call civil wars in Africa aren't really civil wars. They've evolved into something different. Why do I think that? Why do I think these wars have evolved into something different? Because in many of these wars, they're not fighting over the state anymore. Now, we can argue whether they're fighting over resources, diamonds, gold, coltan, timber, whether they're fighting over economic patrimonial resources. But in many cases, the capital is not the goal. It's not the line in the sand. It's not the center of gravity. You know that term because you're all military. The capital is no longer the center of gravity. Something else is. Economic networks are the center of gravity. Gold and coltan, land rights, are the center of gravity. These aren't civil wars. I'm harping on this point because this is where you as Africans have to tell us how to define your wars. We call them civil wars because we're from the West and we're used to civil wars. They make sense to us. So we use what makes sense to us to explain to you your own conflicts. And I'm telling you, I think we have it wrong. These civil wars can be reform insurgencies. Uganda was considered a reform insurgency. Rwanda, some people would call a reform insurgency. And some of them become warlord insurgencies, which you all know about. I'm here to argue that there's a third kind of conflict, the conflict that I think that we are currently engaged in. I think we have a third kind of conflict that you're going to have to confront possibly the rest of your military career. And these are conflicts that I call wars across states. Wars across states. Why is this important for understanding conflict and national security in Africa? Wars across states have different actors, staging, and scripts than classical wars. Africa has very few interstate wars, as you know. I'll get back to that later. African countries do not tend to attack other African countries. Tanzania, Uganda, Ethiopia, Eritrea, once in a great while, but not often. Some people say that means they have civil war, and I'm saying maybe not. The actors are different because the actors in these wars, and what places am I thinking about? The Eastern DRC, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Darfur, Sudan, and Chad, and possibly, but I'll ask you later, the Trans-Sahel, Mali, Nigeria, Niger, Libya. These wars have different actors because the people doing the fighting don't belong to a national army. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Now, how do you deal with that? In the introduction to my comments today, we talked about how you have to understand civilian, military, police operations. All these things go together because the combatants are not necessarily wearing a uniform. You know that. Here in America, we've been struggling for this since 9/11. It's not just you, right? We still struggle with how to define the enemy. If you ask an American national security expert who's the enemy, you'll get 10 different answers. Right? The actors are different. They are non-state actors and state actors and hybrids. What's a hybrid? You probably all know the term SOBL. SOBL was a term invented for the soldiers, or the fighters, sorry, the combatants in Sierra Leone. It meant soldiers during the day and rebels at night. Soldiers during the day means you're with an army, and at night you change into civilian clothes and go work in the gold mine for a little while. Right? The actors in these wars are different. If the actors in these wars are different, then I'm going to argue that the type of conflict that you're studying and you have to deal with is so much more complex than anything we've had to study. Right? The challenges are unbelievable. Staging. Wars across states. Classical wars are about two things. Right? Defeating the enemy, center of gravity. Right? United States and the Allies defeats Germany, war's done. Right? War's over. These wars aren't between countries, and they're not even really within countries. Rwanda and Uganda have been involved in the war in the Eastern DRC. The war in Darfur involves both Chadian and Sudanese soldiers. The wars in the Trans-Sahel, which is not one of my case studies, the Trans-Sahel, Mali, Niger, Liberia, includes rebels and soldiers from all over the place. The staging in these wars are by definition regional. What's my punchline? Instead of studying states, we need to study conflict zones. You have conflict zones in Africa. You have the Mono River Basin, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Cote d'Ivoire. You have now the Trans-Sahel, maybe centered on Mali. You have the Eastern DRC Great Lakes region. You have the Horn of Africa, where Somalia, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Sudan, Chad are all interacting. And we'll throw in the CAR, Central African Republic. It seems to be involved in all of them. I don't know why that is. Maybe because of where they are geographically, right in the middle. Now, this is a little bit political sciencey. This is the only slides I brought, but it kind of explains my point. When I started writing this book, The Nature of War in Africa, the first thing I had to do was get into data sets. I had to study where there are wars, and there's lots of them. This comes from the Uppsala Conflict Data Project. You should Google it. Every war, every conflict with 25 casualties or more is listed in this data set. It's extremely sophisticated. They have geographical location apps. You can click on any little dot where there's a conflict, and then it'll describe what's going on. It's really amazing. And they talk about conflicts, but they define conflict in a very peculiar American or Western way. Conflicts to them are always about states. It's always about states. So they'll talk about this country being in conflict and this country being in conflict, right? My argument is, and then they'll say there's been no conflict there for 4 years, or this place has been peaceful for 4 or 5 years. And my argument is that if you change the optics, if you change how you look at conflict in Africa, and instead of focusing on discrete states, look at the region, you'll get a better picture of the evolution of conflict in Africa than focusing only on individual states. So here's what I did. Burundi, DRC, Rwanda, and Uganda. Red, where's the English one? Right there. Okay. Red means major conflict, major war. That means 1,000 deaths. Green means minor conflict. Okay. White or empty means none at all. So you go through there and you see times when there's only minor conflict, correct? You see times when there's no conflict, right? Look at the DRC. No conflict between 91 and 95. No conflict between 2002, 2005. I don't buy that. I don't believe it. Here's what happens if you combine it. If you look at the region instead of the states, there's been conflict in Africa almost in the Great Lakes District almost continuously from 1989 all the way to 2007, which is the last data set I have. I could keep going. The conflict in the Great Lakes region, I'm only using this as an illustration because it's my first case study. The conflict in the Great Lakes region is not about the Eastern DRC. It's not about the DRC, right? It's about the region. You guys know the history of this conflict. After the genocide in Rwanda, right, the ADFL, mainly made up of groups of soldiers from all over the region, overthrows Mobutu Sese Seko in 1996. 2 years later, the war starts again, this time led by a Uganda, Rwanda-backed group called the RCD. Many people say the conflict in the DRC started in 1996. No, it didn't. It started as early as 1959. I'm giving you just one date. Why do I pick 1959? 1959 was the Hutu revolution in Rwanda, right? On the cusp of independence, just before independence, the colonial powers decided to give power back to the Hutu, who were the majority in Rwanda. So they took the power away from the Tutsi. I'm not making any comments on whose rights are wrong. I'm just talking about facts. When they did that, when they overthrew the Tutsi government in 1959, many of those Tutsi escaped to what is the Eastern DRC and to Uganda. The president of Uganda would not be president if it wasn't without the help of the Tutsi that used to live first in Rwanda, then in the Eastern DRC, and then in Uganda. The army that overthrew the Hutu in Rwanda were made up of Tutsis that had lived in Uganda and helped that president come to power. We have a name for these guys. We call them soldiers without borders. Soldiers without borders. So the national security context of Africa is very complex. If you focus on the DRC or Rwanda or Uganda, Rwanda, you'll get one picture. You'll get that picture. If you focus on the region, you get this picture. Now, one last point about this. Look at the white squares, 93 and 95. 93 and 95 means no conflict. Well, I know you know this. What was going on in 1993? Well, the Rwanda insurgency started in 1990, right? The Tutsis crossed Uganda into Uganda in 1990 and were marching towards Kigali. I don't know why there's a white square there in 1993. I do know there was an army in Rwanda marching towards Kigali in 1993. We all know that, okay? What happened in 95? That's the year between the genocide and when the ADFL went into the Eastern DRC. There's plenty of fighting going on now. They just didn't know it. So we've moved from coup d'etats to civil wars to reform insurgencies to round 2 of civil wars. I'm arguing there's something different. I'm giving you a new term, wars across states, right? One last evolution in the nature of conflict in Africa, violent extremism. I don't know where to put violent extremism. It's something a little bit different. Here we're talking about Boko Haram, which, as I told you, I get at least one article every month on Boko Haram. usually from Nigerian colleagues. So I learn a lot. Usually Nigerian colleagues, academics, send me articles on Boko Haram. I read it at least once a month. And Somalia, of course. So this is the 5th evolution of war in Africa. Why does this matter? If wars across states are a regional phenomenon, if you understand my argument, in other words, they're not contained within one state. These wars tend to spread across states. Violent extremism is global. Violent extremism is global. You all know about American Somalis going to Somalia and fighting from Minneapolis, for instance, right? America's directly, obviously, we're still fighting a war on terror. America's directly involved in this. So that's my thumbnail sketch of the nature of war in Africa. Let me go back quickly to how these relate to the 2 big strategic issues that Marshall talked about, the big picture. The big picture. What is the big picture if I'm right? What's the vision? The big picture is this. In order to solve Africa's security conundrums, you have to deal with states, regions, and external actors. Everybody in here that wants to be an expert on African security has to be an expert on your state, on your region, and on international actors. Just 2 points there. And this is really hard. And this is really, really hard. Number 1, the paradox of regionalism. The paradox of regionalism. As you know, Africa is expected, and I know as an American, we want you to organize yourself regionally, right? You have the African Union, you have the regional economic communities, and hopefully you'll have these standby brigades. You have ECOMOG, you have SADC, and you have other groups, right? We're asking you to, and you are trying to, under the Charter of the African Union, to organize yourself into regions. Here's the paradox. In order to organize yourself into regions, you as leaders of states have to cede some of your sovereign authority to the region. You have to give up some of your sovereign imperatives, some of your sovereign power to the regional organization. I don't know about you, people don't like to give up power. Why would you want to give up power to the African Union, to ECOMOG, or to SADC? Here's the paradox. Many African states are still developing themselves. Many African states are still relatively weak. You're asked to give something up you don't have. You're asked to give something up you do not have. What don't you have? You may not have control of your country. The DRC doesn't. Sudan doesn't. Chad doesn't. Right? If you don't have control of your territorially defined state, how do you give up control of your state to the AU? It's the Africa paradox. What's the model that we're built on? The European Union. The European Union. So the European Union, individual European states have ceded authority to Brussels. Easy for them to do. They already have authority. They were well-developed, what we call Weberian states. Then they gave up power. So what are we asking you to do? What are we, meaning outsiders, what are we asking Africa to do? We're asking you to build strong regions and strong states simultaneously. We didn't do it. We weren't that smart. We didn't figure that out. But we're asking you to build strong regions through the AU, the RECs, regional economic communities, and standby brigades. We're asking you to share your sovereignty with your neighbors before you're even really truly secure in that sovereignty in many cases. We're asking a lot, which we'll get back to leadership in a few minutes. Second paradox, the paradox of strong states. The paradox of strong states. A friend of mine once said, Africa doesn't fight other African countries because they're too weak to wage war. Africans don't fight other Africans because their military is not strong enough yet to attack across the border. Well, you know what the logic is there? When you get stronger, what will you be able to do? Anybody? If African states don't attack neighbors because they're not strong enough to, what happens when you become strong? You may want to dominate. It's a second paradox. So I have two paradoxes. The regional state paradox. The second paradox is the paradox of a strong state. Africa doesn't have interstate war. The last big interstate war was Ethiopia versus Eritrea. Who had the biggest army in Africa? Ethiopia, right? So as you get stronger, what are you as future military leaders going to have to deal with? There's going to be pressure when you get stronger to be more aggressive, to throw your weight around a little bit. I'm an American. I know about throwing my weight around, okay? There's going to be pressure to do this. Currently, you don't have interstate wars. You have civil wars, warlord wars, wars across states because you're weak. These wars are a product of state weakness. State strength will lead to a whole new set of capabilities, and you're going to have to think about that. All right. Let me tie this to ethics. Leading, last part so I can open the question. Leading Marshall's way. Leading Marshall's way. How do we use Marshall's rules of ethical leadership? I would argue, if you follow what I've been saying, that the biggest challenge for African security is to get the African Union working, to get the regional economic communities working, to get the standby brigades to work, to have external actors like America and the EU to help you do that, but that you have to stand up and you have to do that. The infrastructure for African leadership in Africa, is already there. It's called APSA, the Africa Peace and Security Architecture. You all know about it. How do George C. Marshall's rules of ethical leadership relate to that? Number one, candor. Speak honestly and responsibly. When you're in an organization like the African Union or the UN or SADC or ECOWAS, you are dealing with strangers. You're dealing with neighbors. They're not your friends necessarily. They're not your family. They're not from your part of the country. How do you build trust with strangers? Only by being honest and responsible. If they don't believe you, they're not going to work with you, right? So candor, which is an ethical, being candid, honest, is an ethical thing. We teach our children, don't lie. My 14-year-old daughter lies to me all the time, right? I always say, stop lying to me. Don't lie. But lying, it isn't just one of the 10 commandments that you're not supposed to do. Lying leads to bad behavior. I know you know this, because I lived in Africa for 3 years. And in my village in Zambia, people didn't lie to each other because they all lived there together, right? They lied to outsiders sometimes because they weren't part of their family. But I'm saying that the AU is your family, and if you're not honest and open with them, they won't trust you. And then when you try to go fight a war with them, they won't trust you. Candor. Commitment. Adhere to what is right. Adhere to what is right. You have the African peer review mechanism developed in 2003. You know what it is. The African peer review mechanism holds everybody in this room to higher standards. Well, commit yourself to it. That's all I'm saying. Now, I'm not here to judge you. I'm just relating Marshall to your challenges. You wouldn't have an African peer review committee if you didn't need it. So I'm saying the infrastructure there is sitting right there. You have everything you need. You just need to commit to it. Courage. Stand up at home and abroad. Here's what's really important. Stand up at home. And now here I am, an American, telling you this, where we just had the most messed up 2 weeks in my life. All right? So feel free to ask me about my country. All right? We didn't do so well in the courage department for the last 2 or 3 weeks, frankly. Right? I know that. I get it. Okay? I'm just talking about Marshall here. Stand up at home and abroad. I think abroad is more important. You know what's best for you. I don't care if the EU is paying for it, the United States is paying for it, or China is paying for it. You tell us, right, what works best. We have our own theories and our own ideas, but our ideas and our theories are filtered through our own historical experiences and cultures. And we're all in this world together, but I grew up different than most of you did, probably. I went to different schools. Courage to speak to your own leadership and to speak to the external actors who have all the money, right? You got to tell us what works best. Integrity, speak and act with honor. That means leading by example. Selflessness. It's the second to last one I'm going to talk about. Selflessness means service above self-interest. There's two dimensions to this. You as individual military officers know what that means. Also means that in order for, I'll pick on South Africa because that's where I lived and I wrote my first book. In order for South Africa to be a leader in Africa, South Africa has to think about Botswana, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Mozambique, Angola, Swaziland, Namibia, all the SADC countries. Selflessness means individual countries, Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, the ones that are a little bit richer, have to think about their neighbor as soon as they think about themselves. So not just on the individual level, but on the regional level and on the continent, you have to be selfless. And then last was choose the right people. You know what that means? Choose the right people means choose people for how good they are at the job, not because they're your cousin. All right? Hey, we do this in America. All right? Yes. We do this all the time. We choose the wrong people all the time. But all of us have to get it right. Choose people for what they bring to the table, all right? And that doesn't mean, food. It means expertise, right, to get the job done. Now, I was asked in conclusion, I wish I had given you these slides, to give you one example of leadership that I like. Here's mine. I lived in Africa, South Africa, 93, 94. I lived there. I was writing my first book during the transition to majority rule. It was fascinating. My fiancée came out to visit me right at the end, and her father tried to stop her from coming to South Africa because it was dangerous, right? As we were getting close to the elections in 1994, it got a little dangerous. Some groups wanted to participate in the New South Africa. Some groups didn't want to participate in the New South Africa. And there were car bombings. Even 2 blocks from where I lived, a car blew up. And South Africa could have been born a very different place if you don't know the history. It could have been born a fractured country. It could have been Afrikaner, Zulu, and Xhosa, for instance. At the 11th hour, we know what happened. Nelson Mandela and F.W. de Klerk made a deal. It's an amazing thing, and I lived through it, and I was writing about it and researching it. I interviewed hundreds of people, ANC, Afrikaners, everybody I could. It was a great time to be there. I told you I watched the elections in Soweto. I was welcomed into Soweto. I couldn't go there a week before. It was too violent for somebody like me to go there. But I was welcomed to sit in Soweto, watch Nelson Mandela get elected. Nelson Mandela and F.W. de Klerk got the Nobel Peace Prize because of that peaceful transition. We sometimes call it the South African miracle. But there's another man that was involved that you very rarely hear about. Maybe some of you have. His name is General Constant Viljoen. Constant Viljoen. That's that guy in the uniform. Who is he? And why is this my example of leadership? Now, I'll be honest, Nelson Mandela is my hero. Most people like me that studied Africa for 25 years, he's our hero. Constant Viljoen's a hero, too. He was the ex-head of the South African military. There was a group of Afrikaners who wanted to create a Volksstaat, their own state, and they were incredibly violent. When my father-in-law said, I don't want my daughter to come visit you in South Africa, he wasn't talking about Zulu on Xhosa violence. He was talking about what this group of Afrikaners might do. They didn't want Nelson Mandela to become president. You all know that. It's not a gigantic group, but it's significant. Why? There are a lot of ex-military leaders and a lot of guns. And a lot of pickup trucks. I don't know why. They all have pickup trucks. Constant Viljoen is their leader. He's the ex-head of the military. He's a conservative Afrikaner. At the 11th hour, he says, no, I'm not doing it. I'm not leading you in a civil war against this new country that's forming right in front of our eyes. I'm not doing it. And not only would he not lead the Afrikaners into a civil war, he ran for the presidency. He wasn't going to get elected. There was no chance. I have a better chance of getting elected. No chance Constant Viljoen is going to get elected as vice president or president in the new South Africa. He ran for office. He told his people, were the conservative right-wing Afrikaners, I'm not doing it. I'm not thinking of myself. I'm not thinking of you guys. I'm going to be selfless. I'm going to show some courage. I'm going to show some integrity. And largely because of him, South Africa was born a peaceful country. And that's one of my favorite examples of leadership.